Okay, I'm live, I believe. So what I'm doing is I'm going to read one page from Pete Walker's book, and it's Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. And what I'm doing is reading about psychoeducation and cognitive healing. So if you've just popped on, I'm reading about psychoeducation and cognitive healing. I'm going to read one page, and it's Pete Walker, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. The other book that he has, which I want to refer you to, is The Tao of Fully Feeling. And this book is extremely helpful to people who have complex PTSD or who have been told they have complex PTSD issues, which is basically, it comes from trauma in childhood. It's years of abuse, and it's a place where we basically need to heal. We need to be able to look at our past and heal that so that we begin to live fully. So what I've got is one page that I'm going to read, and it's psychoeducation and cognitive healing, which is going to help give you some information about complex PTSD. So I'm going to start reading, and if anybody pops on, they can say hello to me. So psychoeducation and cognitive healing. Becoming psychoeducated about CPTSD is the first level of addressing the poisonous indoctrination of your mind against your healthy ego. When you intricately understand how antagonistic your parents were to your healthy sense of self, you become more motivated to engage in the self-help processes of rectifying their damage. So if you've been through childhood trauma and it lasted for years, what you're going to see as an adult, that you're going to realize that you've got lots of issues and you don't understand why you've got those issues. You're going to label yourself with things maybe that you don't have, and you're going to think there's something wrong with you, and you might go into anxiety and panic attacks. And also you'll have something which is called arrested development, because when a child is abused over many years, whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, or sexually, or verbally, what happens is the child shuts down. And in that shutdown, the part of us shuts off. So it's like a split in the soul. And it means that we struggle as adults to have healthy, normal, loving relationships. We abandon ourselves and we don't know how to look after ourselves properly. And a lot of adults walking around today, who are on anxiety pills and having panic attacks and stuff like that, it's coming from childhood. So continuing reading. He says here that the more you identify their damage, the more you identify the damage that you have now with what happened in childhood, if it did, of course, we're not making things up here. It means that you know what needs to be fixed. This is essential because without a properly functioning ego, you have no center of making healthy choices and decisions. All too often, your decisions are based on the fear of getting into trouble or getting abandoned, rather than on the principles of having meaningful and equitable interactions with the world. You can learn to gradually replace the critic's toxic perspective with a viewpoint that supports you in your life and that stops you from unnecessary scaring yourself. You are now free. You are free now as an adult to develop peace of mind and a supportive relationship with yourself. A self-championing stance can transform your existence from struggling survival in a fulfilling sense of thriving. So we can get to thriving, but first we have to really look at the events that took place in childhood that have been very damaging and upsetting. And, they give people things like nightmares, people disassociate as adults, and people get involved in, crappy relationships, the wrong relationships, codependent relationships, doing work they don't love, and they don't have the self-esteem to stand up for themselves. And I was like that for many years. I was doing something that I did not love, and also feeling inferior in the world because of the way I was treated as a child. He goes on to say, you can begin right now by inviting your instincts of self-compassion and self-protection to awaken and bloom in your life. Cognitive healing may have begun or been reinforced by reading what has preceded this. So I'm reading one page from Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. He says, hopefully you have some epiphanies about what is at the core of your suffering. Some readers may have been searching for cognitive answers for years, and through their reading and therapy already created a sizable foundation for doing this work. At the same time, those who have only tried a cognitive behavioral approach, being CBT, to healing their trauma, may feel great resistance to hearing that cognitive work is important. If you are like me, you have been introduced to it in a way that has promised more than could have been delivered. Cognitive tools are irreplaceable in the healing in healing cognitive issues, but they do not address all the levels of our wounding. They are especially limited in addressing emotional issues, as we will see below. In early recovery, the psychoeducation piece on cognitive work typically comes from the wisdom of others, teachers, writers, friends, and therapists who are more informed on this subject than we are. When psychoeducation reaches its most powerful level of effectiveness, however, it begins to morph into mindfulness. Actually, I'm just going to continue reading this a little bit on mindfulness with regard to complex PTSD. He says, psychologically speaking, mindfulness is taking undistracted time to become fully aware of your thoughts and feelings so that you can become more and more, you have more and more choice in how you respond to them. Do I really agree with this thought, or have I been pressured into believing it? So we really have to look at that. It's like, you know, where people say, if you've been through huge amounts of abuse, people might say, you know, that, for instance, like, you have to forgive your parents. It's like, do you really believe that? It's like, have you been told that? We've got to look at every piece of our abuse and look at what's real for us, because really the reality is, it's going to be in getting rid of the inner critic. This is Pete Walker's work. We get rid of the inner critic. We get to healthy grieving. We get healthy anger and healthy blame. And as we grieve and we cry the tears for that child that was abused for years and year in, year out, we begin to gain our self-esteem back. So it's a long process. And the book is below in the link below. You'll see it. The book is free on USA Audible, Amazon USA Audio, and it's free on Kindle, Amazon Kindle UK. Continuing on this bit on mindfulness, he says, mindfulness is a perspective that weds your capacity for self-observation with your instinct of self-compassion. It is therefore your ability to observe yourself from an objective and self-accepting viewpoint. It is a key function of a healthily developed ego, and is sometimes described as the observing ego or the witnessing self. So, you know, if you're into spirituality and spiritual groups, people go on about getting rid of the ego. Without an ego, we wouldn't be able to function on any level. So it's really important. We wouldn't be able to make choices either. So being able to judge and have a healthy ego is really important. So we're not trying to get rid of the ego. We're trying to get to the point of having a healthy ego. He says here, mindfulness is a perspective of benign curiosity about all our inner experiences. Recovery is enhanced immeasurably by developing this helpful process of introspection. As it becomes more developed, mindfulness can be used to recognize and disidentify from beliefs and viewpoints that you acquired your traumatizing family. So, you know, in spiritual terms, people will tell you that if you've been through abuse as a child, that people may say to you, well, you chose your family and you chose the abuse. We have to be very careful what we're listening to out there when we're healing CPTSD, because if we can imagine that a child is abused for years in, year out, day in, day out, they're going to be, you know, having particular experiences in life that are very difficult for them. And we were children that became adults. So educating ourselves through psychoeducation is going to be through reading. It also means we get the proper help. For some people, it's going to be therapy. I'm nearly a year into, in September, I'm a year into trauma psychoanalysis, which I've been doing for myself, and it's been very helpful and useful. I've been doing it once a week. And in that, we get to look at what triggers us, you know, why we have the flashbacks, and what we can do, to begin to heal this stuff. But often it's going to be a lot of verbal ventilation. There'll be a lot of tears. There will be some angering. And there are many things that are put down in society, like people will say, oh, you can't be angry. Those are your parents, or you can't, you need to get over it. And there's a lot of untruths that are pushed around. So, for instance, another example, PTSD is widely known, where soldiers go off to war and they come back, or war-torn countries where people have a PTSD event, and it's taken very seriously. But what's not taken seriously in society currently is that people who've been through years of abuse as children, who have CPTSD, which is a complex form of PTSD, because there are so many events and it goes on for so many years. People are not getting the opportunity to heal properly. So continuing, he says, I cannot overstate the importance of becoming aware of your self-commentary. So what he means there is that we will have an inner critic that's going to tell us, make us feel guilty, believe that there's something wrong with us, and that we're not good enough. And we have to get rid of that inner critic. And the best way around that is by having a conversation with it and speaking back to it and telling it to bugger off or go away. That's an English term, but that I use there. But if we don't stand up to it, that voice, we're not going to recover. So it's like dealing with a voice in your head that is not your voice. The other thing is, he says, with enough practice, mindfulness eventually awakens your fighting spirit to resist the abusive refrains from your childhood and to replace them with thoughts that are self-supportive. Mindfulness also helps you to establish a perspective from which you can assess and guide your own efforts of recovering. He says here that chapter 12 contains detailed instruction for enhancing mindfulness as to the writings of Stephen Levine and Jack Canfield and John Kabat-Zinn. He says, finally, it is important to note that mindfulness tends to develop and expand in a progressive manner to all levels of our experience, cognitive, emotional, physical, and emotional and relational. Mindfulness is essential for the guiding us at every level of recovering, and we will examine this principle more closely throughout this book. Bit more on emotional healing. He says, traumatizing parents do as much damage to our emotional natures as they do to our thinking processes. Consequently, there is a great deal of recovery work that needs to be done on this level. This is especially true because of the damage our wider society also does to our emotional natures. Because, when we've got like religious beliefs where they say, honor thy mother and father, my view is that we need to flip that and tell people, honor thy children. That's my belief. But I won't argue with the world's beliefs. But this is the book I'm reading from, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving. The other one that I'm reading currently, and I don't know if I'll be allowed to read it on YouTube. I'll have to inquire whether I'll be able to read sections of this book, which is called Trauma and the Soul, and it's by Donald Kalshad, who is a Jungian therapist. And this book is stunningly beautiful. It's really I'm into chapter 2. I'm at the end of chapter 2 and starting chapter 3. And this book has really touched me deeply in the first 2 chapters. I think this is, higher levels of going into the depth of what trauma is and how it affects and how it shatters the soul of a child, and how a child then becomes torn inside and doesn't know how to, deal with the world. And they go to a place of safety. So for me, people talks about this. We've got the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And those responses are, conditioned into us, partly as human beings. The fight, flight, freeze, fawn is natural within us, meaning that if we were in the wild and a big tiger approached us, we'd go into fight, flight, we'd run, or we'd fight the tiger to protect ourselves, or we'd go into freeze out of fear, or we'd fawn, we'd start being nice to the tiger in order to, appease it. And when we do that, when we've been through childhood trauma, it's not just childhood trauma, but mainly when we've been through that as adults, we'll get into relationships with other people, and every relationship is a relationship. It's not just intimate relationships, but we'll get into dealing with other people and not be able to be ourselves fully because we've been cut off, because we've got been disassociated because of the abuse of childhood. The other thing I would say is that, be it sexual abuse, verbal abuse, or physical abuse, or emotional abuse as a child, the issue is that we can't say one's worse than the other, because a child is a child. So if you took, 4 children and, one had sexual abuse, one had verbal abuse, one had physical abuse, or one had emotional abuse, a child is a child, and it's going to, slaughter that child's development. And it's time that, this information for me was more widespread, and that they were teaching complex PTSD in schools, and teaching youngsters the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Because in schools, if there was any funny business going on in the family home, it would mean that they would get the opportunity to put their hand up and say, hey, this is happening to me at home. And then it gets not investigated so much. But also, the other thing I'd like to see in society, for the people that do have anger issues, who are parents, or also where there are paedophiles and who are sexually abusing children, that they have somewhere to go in order to start their own healing process, so that they stop abusing children, because there is really no need for it. It's the abuse of small children. Children have no power, they have no say. And generally, any decent human being would know when they're being pushed over the edge and maybe behaving in ways that are dangerous, not only to the children, but for themselves. We're intelligent human beings, and most of us are. And if people have addictions that are sexual addictions towards children, they need to go out there and actually go somewhere and be able to get help. So there should be, I think, in society, I don't like the word should, but there could be, something set up where people can, go in privacy and start working on their addictions that are harmful to children. So that's all I'm going to say today. And I'll be back tomorrow with some more. And I hope this has been useful for anybody watching out there. And thank you for anybody that's been watching this live tonight. Okay, I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you. Good night.